Hello lovely humans, welcome to this space on the internet. Let's talk about lavender marriages. A lavender marriage is a marriage between a man and a woman which allows the concealing of one or both partners' queer identities, done out of convenience or to navigate society with fewer obstructions related to sexuality, partnership, and social stigma. In essence, these are heterosexual seeming relationships on a social and legal level, which allow for non-heterosexual people access to some of the benefits afforded to heterosexual couples. As you may or may not already know, the color lavender or purple, in all of its shades, has long held an association with the queer community and queer identities, in particular homosexuality. This association appears to have developed in part due to a long history of artists alluding to the theme. So let's go way back and talk about Sappho de Lesbos. Sappho was an early Greek poet residing on the island of Lesbos, the word from which the term lesbian would later be derived. Very little remains of her actual poetry, and what does is all fragmented, so much of our actual knowledge of Sappho borders on mythical, and as writers kind of commemorated her even hundreds of years after her original work. Given this, it should go without saying that she was extremely famous, and is a figure from which modern feminists have drawn inspiration. Sappho in particular used a lot of flower imagery in her poetry, and love is more often than not a central theme in her writing. While there is plenty to be said about Sappho and her works, I will just be focusing on some select examples that kind of illustrate my point here. Specifically, instances of her use of purples, especially relating to floral imagery, as a point of potential origin for the lavender queer association. Sappho's poem beginning with "But you, O Dika, wreathe lovely garlands in your hair" is an example of her use of flower images, and a poem indicating reverence of, and arguably romantic or sexual interest for, another woman. An example of her use of purple in her work is "Come from heaven wrapped in a purple cloak, like the mountain hyacinth, the purple flower." Now we're advancing quite a bit through history here. According to John Charles Duffy, in his article Gay-Related Themes in the Fairy Tales of Oscar Wilde, some Victorian men were quick to denounce sex between men, but also advocates of what Duffy terms strong friendship. While on the topic of relationship types, I think it's interesting to refer to Duffy's use of John Simond, a historian, as an example of a proponent of close and profitable sympathy to human beings. Simond used terms which included Achillean friendship, heroic friendship, and Greek love to describe the nature of this friendly male relationship. Duffy notes that these terms were all intended to emphasize the nobility of the relationship. The LGBTQIA+ wiki page defines Achillean as an identifier for a man or man-aligned individual who is attracted to other men and men-aligned people, which could also be seen as a complement term to Sapphic, which describes women and women-aligned people who are attracted to women and women-aligned people. The site also mentions the homoromantic connotations of Achilles and Patroclus' relationship in the Iliad and Simon's later use of the word to describe the form of love which he presumably saw between these two Greek mythological figures, and in his own life, which involved loyalty, respect, and deep camaraderie. More personal commentary here, but one of my all-time favorite books is Mackenzie Lee's The Gentleman's Guide to Vice and Virtue, which follows what you might call a strong male friendship, or an Achillean friendship, between two young men on their grand tour through Europe, I believe in the early 1800s. This is a queer fictional story, and the pair eventually catch feelings for one another after years of intimate childhood friendship. And I think Lee probably intentionally made this a reflection of the time when the trajectory of queer relationships was not so clear-cut, but also a reflection of, say, Simon's Achillean idea of relationships developing between male adventurers. But let's return to Oscar Wilde, who lived and wrote in the years after the story of The Gentleman's Guide to Vice and Virtue. Duffy's article goes on to argue the underlying gay themes within Wilde's writing, being careful to acknowledge that men loving men would have been viewed differently, particularly in the absence of the clear-cut linguistic descriptors that we have now, such as homosexuality and homophobia. As addressed before, a strong male friendship, might I say akin to a QPR, was also viewed differently, and thus the themes of men loving men were portrayed in a light resembling a queer platonic relationship, my words, not Duffy's, as opposed to usual romantic and sexual portrayals associated with heterosexual couples. Oscar Wilde is a person to whom the adoption of lavender as a symbol for gay culture in the modern world is sometimes related. A CNN article by Christabel Hastings mentions that lavender synthetic dyes were not present until the 19th century, near the end of which Wilde lived. After its invention, lavender became popular in fashion, only to be later denounced in the rise of aestheticism in the latter half of the 19th century, a movement that which Oscar Wilde was a part. It appealed to artists and creatives of the time, the main principle of the movement being that art can or should exist to be beautiful rather than politically or educationally valuable. In this way, current critics argue that Oscar Wilde and aestheticism is an early example of sensuous and flamboyant gay stereotypes.
The disco dancing, Oscar Wilde reading, Streisand ticket holding friend of Dorothy, know what I'm saying?
Oscar Wilde's writing is also accused of containing purple prose, which is essentially over-the-top sensory descriptions, which distract from the narrative, but do stylized writing. In this way, purple is also associated with being florid and fanciful. Later still, violet and purple were allegedly used as symbols for lesbianism in 20th century Paris amongst the group Paris Lesbos. Lavender to mean gay is also iterated in the Lavender Scare of the 1950s, which occurred essentially in tandem with the Red Scare. Both occurred primarily in America and impacted the American workforce. This was the point at which lavender became a now subversive and resistant symbol, like it is generally considered to be today. The Red Scare was a fear-driven expulsion of accused communists from government jobs, which caused general fear of communist ideals and the possibility of communist presence in the American population. Note that I'm referring to the second wave of the Red Scare during the Cold War following World War II, not the one following World War I. The Lavender Scare mirrored the Red Scare, but instead of omnipotent fear of communism, it was a fear of gay people, and truly their rumored allegiance to the Soviet Union and communism. The reason the Lavender Scare managed to get so out of hand, resulting in the removal of gays and lesbians and even suspected gays and lesbians from their work, was because of baseless homophobia. The politics, morals, and behaviors and sanity of gay people in America were questioned heavily, devolving into opinions such that gays were more prone to manipulation and betrayal. Gayness was thereby seen as an enemy of Americanism. And this laid the groundwork for legal discrimination against queer people in our modern society. Using the term lavender, which had not carried such poor connotations before the 20th century, this is my analysis based on my reading, not an objective fact, its use against gay people sparked an oppositional movement to, in essence, reclaim lavender, which had long been used as a witty word meaning gay. All this to say,
purple's cool.
Purple is pretty well associated with gay people and gay feelings, experiences, and relationships. Now let's talk more specifically about lavender marriages. I watched Jessica Kelgren-Fozard's YouTube video about lavender marriages for some background knowledge. I noticed that in the comment section, plenty of people were describing their own experiences of lavender relationships, or that of their friends, especially within the army and policing jobs. The video itself addressed lavender marriage's presence in the 1920s and 30s Hollywood, where queer acceptance was at something of a high, even in film. However, gay actors and actresses were still arranged into heterosexual marriages, lavender marriages, if you will, in order to preserve the reputation of stars and avoid speculation on their sexualities. Many of these marriages ended rather quickly, though there were a fair few that developed into some degree of intimate and true friendship, sometimes leading to children and long-standing union. If you want more specific examples of actual Hollywood lavender marriages, go watch Jessica's video. On the topic, Taylor Jenkins' Reid novel, The Seven Husbands of Evelyn Hugo, which I recently read, features fictional lavender marriages amongst Hollywood stars of the 50s through to the 80s. Just a note, if you are keenly against spoilers, I recommend you skip ahead to a given time spot. The arrangement of note are the two heterosexual marriages in which all members are queer, and in actuality the two women are living together as if married, and the same goes for the two men. Their marriages act as a cover for their actual relationships, and they form their own family. This was an interesting depiction because Evelyn, the protagonist, marries her gay best friend, Harry, who describes his hopes for a relationship with her as, "I want to be with someone I love. I want to have a companion. I'd like to bring someone home to my family. I don't want to live alone anymore, and I want a son or a daughter. We could have that together. I can't give you everything, I know that, but I want to raise a family and I'd love to raise one with you." This marriage is done with the knowledge and consent of everyone involved, and it's also done out of deep love and true affection. The book touches on the benefits these stars reaped from their lavender marriages, going out to dinner and maintaining their careers. Interestingly, Evelyn also had a very mutually beneficial, calculated marriage with another man before this, where they both agreed to not sleep with each other and essentially lead their own private, discreet lives, which works to both of their benefits because her husband enjoys pursuing romantic and sexual relationships with many people. While this isn't a lavender marriage, so to speak, because there wasn't the common knowledge that Evelyn was bisexual, but it is one of the several anti-amatonormative relationships featured in the book. I think that the author was wise to depict Evelyn, who is part of these relationships, as knowing that each of these relationships had positive sides and had negative sides, and that they served different purposes in her life, which, in my eyes, is a core value of relationship anarchy. But enough about fictional and non-fictional Hollywood. Let's discuss some other venues which created the need or desire for lavender marriages. In the United States, the Don't Ask, Don't Tell policy was active with regard to military members. This was in response to the previous banning of queer people from the US military. Now, under this law, there would be no inquiry into your sexual orientation, but if you were openly gay, lesbian, or bisexual, you could be discharged. It doesn't, therefore, seem like a stretch to assume that some military members would have arranged lavender marriages in order to preserve their roles in the military. Of course, all of these forms of lavender marriage pertain mostly to white, middle, and upper class Americans. And while this is the context in which they have historically been the most popularized, lavender marriages are known to have existed and continue to exist in non-American and non-Western cultures. For example, many Indian newspapers, such as Outlook India, Hindustan Times, and Times of India, reported on the film Badhai Do, forgive my pronunciation, which was released in 2022. The film featured a gay man and a lesbian woman who decide to be lavender married in order to escape familial and societal judgment for their identities. Director of the show, Harshavardhan Kulkarni, explains in Outlook that the writers of the show had learned that lavender marriages were common in China, and in India as well. The film follows Sumi and Shardul, who decide to marry in order to appease their families, whose traditional values push them towards marriage, parenthood, and heteronormativity. The movie managed to touch on misogyny within lavender marriages, and how Sumi and Shardul's relationship impacted them differently due to the expectations of their gender, and also because Shardul was at times sexist. Another aspect of note is that Shardul originally approached Sumi about the possibility of a lavender marriage after hearing that she was only romantically interested in women, with the additional benefit of the two being of the same caste. Badhai Do shows how, in addition to bypassing heteronormative barriers in society, lavender marriages, and by extension any marriage made of convenience or strategy, as opposed to a romantic connection, can also function to bypass social barriers, such as the caste system. Despite the film's arguably insensitive portrayal of adoption as a purely positive, easy fix to have children without heterosexual sex being involved, it also attempts to portray a unique family unit where the same-sex partners of Sumi and Shardul are involved in varying extents to the baby's life, and the two remain married in order to maintain legal adoption rights. For some context, India's law outlining same-sex sexual activity was dismantled in 2018, and it only now penalizes non-consensual sex. You can see, though, that this was obviously quite recent. In China, lavender marriages are sometimes called tongqi and tongfu, meaning the wives of gay men and husbands of gay women, respectively. The article I found reviewing research of these relationships has a neutral to negative outlook on them. Of course, these specific terms, tongqi and tongfu, do imply that it is less often two queer people coming together in a lavender marriage, but more often one, and it is done in an attempt to skirt social rejection or consequences. However, the sociological solution to the downfall of these lavender marriages is to focus on queer acceptance so as to limit fear, shame, and other social consequences of same-sex intimacy. I do not want to discount that for many of these lavender marriages it was or is indeed out of survival, and that they would simply much prefer to be open about their sexuality and lovers. Lavender marriages are a result of homophobia. Homophobia! Whether instated by the customs and laws of a nation, public opinion, or even personal protection. However, I also think it's interesting to think about the ways these relationships are distinct from other relationships, and what there is to gain not just from the social benefits of appearing straight, but also from being in a relationship as a gay person to someone who knows you are gay and not sexually attracted to them, especially if they themselves are also gay. What type of partnership does this foster? I imagine one of the beauties of a lavender marriage is that the rules are not defined, much like in queer platonic relationships. Those involved in a lavender marriage, with the presumption of mutual respect, can decide for themselves the level and types of intimacy that they want from one another, whether it is simply a legal bond with little to no contact, or a very strong, complex bond involving one or many forms of love. I also recognize that lavender marriages hold with them a degree of secrecy, or even some degree of deceit. In the same way the word or color lavender have been used as discreet signaling, lavender marriages are generally not the type which are open about the nature of the relationship. Lavender marriages are one way in which queer people have harnessed the institution of marriage, its legal, social, and religious value, and made it their own. That is all the information and commentary I have about lavender marriages. If you have any questions or further commentary, feel free to put them in the comments. I also have my sources in the description box. So farewell, lovely humans, and we'll see you next time on this space in the internet. Bye!